It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Ed Larson, professor of law from Pepperdine University.
I want to begin by commending these guys for putting together an amazing lineup. I'm not talking about myself, I'm talking about the others. What a group in the middle of summer. The only people I know who succeeded in get this strong a lineup to come to Tennessee in the middle of a summer was the defense team at Dayton and the experts they brought there who never got to speak, unlike us. That was a stellar group. But second to them, you've done good. Well, 100 years is a long time in politics, less so in science, and even less so in religion. This year, 2025, marks 100 years since the best-known intersection of those three forces in American culture, the so-called Tennessee monkey trial. In the summer of 1925, after civic leaders indicted John Scopes for teaching about human evolution in the town's public high schools, Dayton, Tennessee became the setting for the most contentious courtroom drama in American history. This is the still from the movie. It became a flashpoint in American history that continues to inspire, unsettle, and provoke. Seen narrowly, Tennessee versus Scopes was a small-time criminal prosecution brought under a new state statute, and Glenn quoted the entire thing for you, so I don't need to repeat it. Now, read broadly, though, that's narrowly, read broadly, it represented a clash of worldviews pitting legendary populist orator William Jennings Bryan and his anti-Darwinist forces against renowned secularist attorney Clarence Darrow and an honor roll of science educators in a timeless battle over science, religion, and their place in American culture. It became a story, wasn't originally, but it became a story of science versus religion. America's democratized pop culture iteration of Galileo's trial. But why Dayton of all places? Journalists, and this is from the trial, journalists asked that question then, and people still wonder about it today. Responding to the invitation of the ACLU, which opposed the statute on free speech, not religious, free speech grounds, town leaders in Dayton, Tennessee, meeting in this drugstore, where during the trial they put up a banner to attract people, owned by the local school board's chair, Frank Robinson, decided to touch that new statute by arranging, and here the participants reenacted it for photographers. These are the actual people reenacting it for photographers. Had a meeting arranging a friendly indictment of a local science teacher named John Scopes. They wanted publicity for their community, these town boosters. Scopes agreed to the scheme, and soon hundreds of reporters and thousands of onlookers descended on Dayton to witness an event that the press billed as a trial of the century before it even began. But the story did not really begin with Dayton or with Scopes. For all intents and purposes, the story began 4 years earlier when Bryan, a self-proclaimed fundamentalist, launched what he called his crusade against evolution that sought to ban teaching about human evolution in public schools. A charismatic fixture in American politics for nearly 3 decades, Bryan had burst on the national stage in 1896 when he won the nomination for president of both the Democratic Party and the Populist People's Party by offering the cure-all solution of bimetallism for an ongoing economic recession. After losing that election, aside from a brief stint as Secretary of State in the Wilson administration, he became a public speaker peddling a shifting arrays of elixirs for whatever then ailed America. Anti-evolutionism simply represented his final nostrum for the nation's woes, and it chiefly appealed to evangelical audiences. Bryan raised it in scores of addresses during the early 1920s, including one right here in this town in Nashville on January 24, 1925, leading to the introduction and then passage of the Tennessee law that spawned the Scopes trial. It was Bryan's law. As an anti-evolution crusader, Bryan was a product of his times. And those times, the early 1920s, were disorientating for many Americans. Whether true or not, many Americans perceived their country as becoming more secular during the period that became known as the Roaring Twenties. Bryan, and this was an actual cover of Life magazine from, I think it's 1926, but it would have been true in 25 as well. Bryan certainly deemed it so, or at least he said so on the stump, that the country was getting less religious. What was his evidence? Well, the typical evidence you get from somebody like Bryan, a populist. Beyond repeating stories, anecdotal stories told him by parents and pastors, Bryan's evidence for the nation's loss of faith rested on primitive public opinion polls published in 1916, finding that half of the social and natural scientists responding expressed disbelief in a personal God, and that among college students surveyed, disbelief in immortality rose from 15% among first-year students to 30% among juniors. Now, Bryan claimed that the poll found this figure top 40% among graduates, but the actual study, if you looked at it, showed it dropping to 24% among seniors, and it did not survey graduates. Whatever the actual facts, and Bryan typically skewed them in favor of his arguments or made them up out of whole cloth. In the aftermath of World War I, the 1920s were deeply unsettling for many. Far surpassing the toll of any prior war, between 15 and 25 million people died during that global conflict. Exaggerating even these numbers, Bryan placed the toll at 30 million in a 1923 article. In speeches after the war, he damned the role of scientists in developing the chemical weapons that made the war so deadly, and blamed a rise in secularism for turning Christian Europe into a slaughterhouse. In particular, he drew on claims of some commentators that a survival of the fittest mentality drove the German war machine to blame the war squarely on Darwin. To destroy the faith of Christians and lay the foundations for the bloodiest war in history would seem enough to condemn Darwinism, Bryan declared in 1921. Historians have described populism as a movement offering simple solutions for real or perceived political, social, or economic problems. In 1890s, bimetallism, or the coinage of silver at a 16-to-1 ratio with gold, was presented as a panacea for the Panic of 1893, the worst economic recession in U.S. history before the 1930s. Bryan wrote it to his nomination for president in 1896. "You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold," he told cheering delegates at the Democratic National Convention. This phrasing played on his appeal to evangelicals. In the early 1920s, out of office and relying on speeches for his income, Bryan had ratcheted up his populist attacks on evolution, which had long been but just a bit player in his addresses. A spellbinding orator who always worked from set speeches because he really could not speak spontaneously. He was not an extemporaneous speaker. They had to be carefully hewed. But boy, when he had a set speech, and we know them all because he published them all and they were all published in booklets. When he had a speech, he was spellbinding. Well, Bryan, by this time, because his how he did it was his speeches would always pick an issue, pick an issue and prod it and prod it and prod it and prod it. Now, Brian had already run through not just bimetallism, which was his first, but evaporated when they discovered gold in Alaska, but also the direct election of senators. He claimed responsibility for that constitutional amendment. A federal income tax. He claimed responsibility for that. Female suffrage. He claimed credit for that constitutional amendment. Treaties to outlaw wars, which he did as Secretary of State, and Jim Crow laws. Segregation was the solution for the problems of the South, as cure-all solutions to social problems. Captured beautifully in this cartoon from the day, the torchbearer and all those, bimetallism, pacifism, prohibition, he claimed responsibility for that constitutional amendment, and then he's carrying anti-evolutionism. Perfect caricature of Brian, in my opinion. Well, beginning in 1921, Brian focused, as this cartoon suggests, on evolutionary teaching as his principal populist prescription for taming the Roaring Twenties. In a series of lectures from this period, from Back to God and In His Image, rising through the Bible and His Enemies, and in the Menace of Darwinism, here's that one, Brian increasingly blamed evolutionary teaching for all manner of social ills, from war and labor unrest to secularism and communism. Darwinism is the basis of the gigantic class struggle that is now shaking society throughout the world, Brian declared in 1921. Why? Because the brute doctrine of the survival of the fittest is driving men to a life and death struggle from which sympathy and the spirit of brotherhood is eliminated. Brian added in 1923, I venture to assert that the unproven hypothesis of evolution is the root cause of nearly all the dissension in the church. A year later, delivering his It Is Written speech, and here he's circled in blue, this is him delivering it, to a national convention of Seventh-day Adventists, Brian boldly asserted all, that's his word, all the ills from which America suffers can be traced back to the teaching of evolution. It would be better to destroy every other book ever written and save just the first 3 verses of Genesis. Well, so much for the Gospel of John. At least, he declared, stop teaching Darwinism to students in tax-supported schools. This became his panacea, repeated in auditoriums, state houses, arenas, and churches across the land into the spring of 1925. The great commoner, as he was then known, only needed a state to administer his elixir. Tennessee became that state in March. From here, Brian's populist crusade against evolution led directly to the Scopes trial. He then volunteered his services as an attorney to prosecute Scopes, which drew in Darrow, the nation's most famous trial lawyer and secularist, to join the defense. Well, the prospects of Brian and Darrow litigating the issues of revealed religion versus naturalistic science and academic freedom versus popular control over public education turned the trial into a media sensation then and the stuff of legend thereafter. Broadcast live over the radio. In time, it became the subject of Broadway plays, Hollywood movies, and Nashville songs. Clearly, Scopes remains the best-known misdemeanor trial in American history. You can see that. This is in the courtroom. There's the microphone. They're all speaking to the microphone. And the cameras. The entire thing was filmed, and the films were shown across the nation. That was the sort of trial that it was. For evolutionists and secularists, the trial's highlight came when the defense called Brian to the stand, ostensibly as an expert witness on the law's purpose, but actually as a means to grill him on the Bible as a source for science instruction. And there they are. There's Darrow questioning Brian during this crossing. Obviously, as you all know, it took place outside because it was a show. And that's where the show was. Nothing to do with that cracks in the floor. That was just a cover. The judge was up for re-election, and he wanted everybody to see it. You claim everything in the Bible should be literally interpreted, Darrow asked at one point. I believe in everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there. Some of the Bible is given illustratively, Brian replied, leading Darrow to retort. But then when you read the whale swallowed Jonah, now how do you literally interpret that? To which Brian affirmed, I believe in a God who can make a whale and can make a man and can make both of them do what he pleases. At other times, Brian conceded points of biblical interpretation generally accepted by conservative Christians at that time. In line with 19th century evangelical thought, for example, when asked by Darrow if the Genesis days of creations necessarily meant 24-hour days, Brian replied very carefully, I do not think it necessarily does. Not satisfied, Darrow shot back, do you think it does? Leading Brian to equivocate. I know a great many people think so. Darrow pressed the point, what do you think, Mr. Brian? Apparently there was a pause there. I don't think it does, but I think it would be just as easy for the kind of God we believe in to make the earth in 6 days, or in 6 years, or in 6 million years, or in 600 million years. I do not think it important whether we believe one or the other. Well, if Brian could interpret Scripture to fit science, the defense crowed. Why can't evolutionists and science teachers? Darrow never asked Brian about, this is from above, from the picture taken above down, because it was right by the side. When you go there on Monday, you can see where this spot is. You can't see that tree, because that tree came down, and this year, the local guy you'll meet there carved things out of it, and he carved a bowl, and he sent it to me. Absolutely beautiful. Love that bowl. Out of the blue, a bowl from that tree came to me. Well, Darrow never asked Brian about evolution. He knew that, given the opportunity, Brian would respond with well-rehearsed answers about the adverse religious and social results of Darwinian thinking. Tell students that they descended from a lower form of animals, he would say, and they'll act like apes. He said that all the time. A survival of the fittest mentality leads to war, he would likely add. He also said that all the time. As Darrow pushed his various lines of questioning, Brian increasingly conceded that he simply did not know the answer. Did you ever discover where Cain got his wife? Darrow asked at one point, referring to one of Adam and Eve's only two children. They were very restrained. They only had 2 children, both of which were male. No, sir, I leave the agnostics to hunt for her, Brian replied. The audience warmly cheered Brian. Darrow received little applause. The only purpose Mr. Darrow has is to slur the Bible, Brian declared near the end. I object to your statements, Darrow shot back. I am examining your fool ideas that no intelligent Christian on earth believes. The judge had heard enough. 2 hours after Brian took the stand, the judge adjourned the court and struck Brian's testimony from the record. Well, despite Darrow's pleas for academic freedom and his humiliating examination, or interrogation, I should say, of Brian, Scopes lost the case, and Tennessee's anti-evolution statute was upheld. Formal and informal state and local restrictions against evolutionary teaching multiplied nationwide, and commercial publishers all but deleted the subject from biology textbooks for 3 decades, until the post-Sputnik Cold War concerns about the quality of American scientific education for defense purposes led to an infusion of federal funds for new science textbooks during the late 1950s. By then, a synthesis of Darwinian selectionism and modern genetics, which had not existed at the time of the Scopes trial, had established evolution as the core concept in biology and the new high school biology textbooks. They're not as good as Ken Miller's, so buy his, but they're pretty darn good. They were authored, as intended by academic scientists, where before that they were always authored by textbook writers, not academic scientists. It was only then, because now we're talking about the late 50s, it was only then that the 1955 play and 1960 Hollywood movie, Inherit the Wind, crystallized a thoroughly modern retelling of what I call the legend of Scopes. In the movie version, town officials led by a fanatical but entirely fictional fundamentalist minister arrest Scopes in his classroom for telling his students about the Darwinian theory of human evolution. Limited to a few sets, the play begins with Scopes jailed Scopes, already in jail, explaining to his girlfriend, "You know why I did it. I had the book in my hand, Hunter's Civic Biology. I opened it and read to my sophomore class, science class, chapter 17, Darwin's Origin of the Species." For doing his job according to the script, you can read it right there, Scopes is, quote, threatened with fine and imprisonment. In the play, if you watch it, this is the directions, a literal lynch mob, and this was an era of lynch mobs in Tennessee, a literal lynch mob of townspeople circle outside the jailhouse. One of them throws a rock through the window. The ensuing prosecution in the Inherit the Wind becomes a virtual religious inquisition, with Brian mercilessly grilling the defendant's invented girlfriend, he didn't have a girlfriend, who happens to be the minister's, this is the script, pretty but not beautiful daughter. About Scopes' religious doubts, nothing of the sort, and questioning him, did he believe, what did he believe, that sort of questions. Nothing of the sort ever happened at the actual trial. Written during the era of blacklisted authors and actors, the actual movie script was written by a blacklisted author. The playwriters inserted it to mock McCarthyites, their intended targets. Inherit the Wind's closing scenes put the final gloss on the Scopes myth. Brian is debunked and anti-evolutionism discredited. In the play and movie, Brian's debunking culminates with the interrogation by Darrow as a defense's surprising closing witness. In Inherit the Wind, and its thoroughly modern reconstruction of that storied encounter, instead of acknowledging an ancient Earth interpretation of the Genesis account, the Brian of Inherit the Wind maintains on allegedly biblical grounds that God created the universe in 6 24-hour days, beginning, and I'm quoting here, on the 23rd of October in the year 4004 BC at the is in the script, at 9 a.m. exclamation point. By the end of his Inherit the Wind testimony, Brian is totally befuddled. Mother, he pleads to his wife in the courtroom, they're laughing at me, Mother. At the actual trial, as suggested by this editorial cartoon at the time, Brian's people were not laughing at him. There's no evidence of that in the courtroom whatsoever. Instead, they were seething at Darrow. At the end of Inherit the Wind, in the movie and play, everyone ignores Brian when he attempts, after the trial is formally adjourned, to deliver a courtroom rant against the theory of evolution, precipitating his fatal collapse. He is carried off stage incoherently, delivering the presidential inaugural address that he never got to give. To ensure that viewers get the point, the writers of Inherit the Wind have Scopes ask Darrow, after the jury convicts him, Did I win or did I lose? Darrow answers, you won. Millions of people will say you won. They will read in their papers tonight that you smashed a bad law, that you made it a joke. Notice it says you'll read it in the papers. You won't read it in the court's decision. You'll read it in the papers. It was a media event. That's how they were treating it. When Darrow hears that Brian has died, and he dies in the movie and in the play, he dies in the courtroom. When Darrow hears that Brian has died, the Inherit the Wind version of the story famously has Darrow quip from the Bible, he that troubles his own house shall inherit the wind, and the fool shall be the servant to the wise in heart. You can tell who he's saying is the fool and who is the wise at heart. Alone in the courtroom at the end, Darrow, in this scene, picks up the defendant's copy of Origin of Species and the judge's Bible, and after balancing them thoughtfully, as if his hands were scales, that's what the script says, the stage directions direct, the attorney slams them together and into his briefcase side by side and walks off quietly. In the movie, to Leslie Uggam singing the Battle Hymn of the Republic. The message was clear. Even in Dayton, the Scopes trial ended in defeat for anti-evolutionists and triumph for the best in science and religion. When the actual trial concluded, however, people generally did not see it as a victory for the defense. To the contrary, in its immediate aftermath, most newspaper editorialists depicted the trial as inconclusive and predicted that the anti-evolution controversy would intensify as a result, both sides stirring up their own side. When Brian unexpectedly died in Dayton a week after the trial, he was lionized by millions. Crowds lined the railroad track, and this is in Chattanooga, where the casket was put on. Crowds lined the railroad track as a special train carried his body to Washington, D.C., where he had a state funeral and was buried in Arlington National Cemetery, while fundamentalist leaders competed to carry on Brian's crusade against teaching evolution. Several states and countless school districts responded to the trial by imposing restrictions on teaching evolution, especially in 1927, when Tennessee Supreme Court upheld the state's law as constitutional in Scopes' appeal. The following year, by popular initiative that garnered nearly 2/3 of the statewide vote, Arkansas followed Tennessee in making it illegal for public school teachers to, and I'm quoting here, to teach the theory or doctrine that mankind ascended or descended from a lower order of animals. An evangelical college named for Brian soon opened in Dayton and has expanded over time. Scopes even came back to celebrate the town's 35th anniversary celebration of the trial, just as we are all going to return on Monday for the 100th, led by Dr. Moore, who knows that town better than anyone who doesn't live there, and knows it more accurately than those that do live there. The growth of Bryan College tracked larger developments within American Christianity. Protestantism's conservative wing has grown at the expense of its mainstream center and modernist wings. Creation science, committed to advocating scientific arguments for a more literal reading of Genesis than even Brian countenanced, has taken root among evangelicals, as captured in this diorama at the Creation Museum, which we're going to hear more about, and this exhibit of humans living among the dinosaurs before the fall. Another one has Adam naming the animals. The years since the Scopes trial are pockmarked with efforts at state and local level, not only to limit the teaching of evolution in public schools, and this is what Glenn's group so magnificently tracks, not only to limit the teaching of evolution in public schools, or to balance it with either creation science or intelligent design, but to advance conservative Christian values generally through creation-friendly education in homeschooling, which has exploded, and Christian Academy. Anti-evolutionism did not die in Dayton, and that's why we're all back here today. Nor did evangelicalism or Christian nationalism. Bryan's brand of religious populism survives in America, and with it, so does the legacy of the Scopes trial. And on Monday, if those of you who go along, you'll be able to see the courthouse, which is no longer the courthouse. It was until my last trip here. Now it's across the street. It's now a museum. And in front of it, you'll see the statues of Bryan and Darrow still looking at each other. And where that testimony occurred, that bandstand right back there, that's where the interrogation took place. Thank you very much.